Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Let us read from another section of Roar of the Ganges. This is a book that we have been reading a few pages at a time. This book takes place from the eyes of the author, Swami Tadatmananda, who has given our Sangha expressed permission for us to read out loud. In North India, along the banks of the Ganga River, also known as the Ganges, from which this book gets its name, Swamiji, then known as Mark, has been studying at an ashram under the guidance of Swami Dayananda. There, in a few days, he will be taking sannyas himself, that is, spiritual renunciation, or, well, worldly renunciation. He's renouncing the world, which is a spiritual thing to do. Here we were discussing the nature of a sage known as Ramana Maharshi. This was another Indian mystic who came just in the last few centuries. Ramana Maharshi was probably the most widely revered saint in India at the time of his death in 1950. He was a remarkable person, even in his youth, when his spiritual vocation began. According to his own account, one day, in his 17th year, he was gripped by the unshakable conviction that he was about to die. Even though he was in perfect health, he was convinced that only moments remained before his death. But instead of being overcome by fear, he calmly reflected on what was about to happen. He said to himself, "Now I am about to die. What does that mean? What is it that dies?" The body dies, he thought. He lay down on the ground and stretched out his limbs stiffly, as though rigor mortis had already set in. He held his breath and imagined that his body was indeed dead. Now what will happen? He pondered. They will carry this body to the burning grounds, set it on a pyre, and burn it to ashes. But with the death of this body, have I died? The body is not I. The body is silent and inert, yet I feel still the full force of my existence, the voice of the I, independent of this body. I am the spirit transcending this body, a spirit untouched by death. The precocious boy began his inquiry into the true nature of the self in an extraordinary way. After this experience, he grew increasingly indifferent towards school and other activities, preferring instead long hours of meditation and daily visits to a nearby temple. Before long, he left home to commit himself totally to spiritual life. He was drawn towards Arunachala, a sacred mountain in South India, where he undertook a life of severe austerity. He remained silent for years, later explaining that he never took a vow of silence, but was instead deeply absorbed in the process of self-inquiry. He meditated in and around an ancient temple at the foot of the mountain, and later took up residence in a cave along its slopes. Slowly, people came to know of the young sadhu on the mountain. He was eventually discovered by several great scholars of Vedanta, one of whom gave him the name Maharshi, great sage. An ashram was built for him at the foot of the mountain where he lived the rest of his life. He met thousands who came seeking instruction for their own spiritual guidance. Yet, he never gave that kind of formal instruction. He preferred instead to engage visitors in informal dialogues, where he reclined on a couch in the meeting hall. A familiar photo shows Ramana with his head propped up on one arm and a gentle smile on his face. His large brown eyes seemed to reveal an ocean of tranquility within. Visitors often forgot their doubts once they came into his presence and became absorbed in the peace pervading the room. Their questions were sometimes met with silence, but more often with simple but profound answers that penetrated to the root of the matter. When someone voiced a complicated inquiry about subtle philosophical points, Ramana would often answer enigmatically, "Who is asking the question? From where does the question arise? Seek out its source. From there you will find your answer." Ramana stressed again and again the importance of self-inquiry in the form, "Who am I?" Although this formula sounds simple, it encompasses the essential teachings of Vedanta, leading the seeker to turn within to discover Atma. Ramana himself explained this inquiry as a process examining the ego, the sense of individuality, or I-ness, as he often called it. He taught that one should trace the sense of I-ness back to its origin to discover the consciousness from which it arises, the consciousness that is Atma. And then, according to Ramana, the very sense of I-ness will vanish, and in its wake one becomes free from bondage of ego, free to dwell in the fullness of reality. A half dozen years ago, I had gone to visit Ramana's ashram while traveling with my friend Vijay. From a distance, the sacred ashram, the sacred mountain Arunachala, seemed to rise from the dusty fields like an enormous linga, the cylindrical icon of Lord Shiva. There is a Shiva linga here, like a linga. Indeed, many Hindus look upon the mountain as an embodiment of Shiva himself and walk barefoot along its entire 12-mile circumference as a form of worship. Vijay and I walked that circuit in addition to visiting the temple and cave where Ramana had stayed. Ramana's ashram is nestled against the mountain's lower slopes adjacent to the town of Tiruvannamalai. Beautiful gardens surround tiny cottages scattered about its spacious grounds. The hall in which Ramana once reclined on a couch is now used for silent meditation. The couch remains there as a shrine of remembrance. Vijay and I had spent hours meditating in the cool darkness of that hall. There, I tried to trace my sense of I-ness back to its origin, following Ramana's method. I watched my thoughts rise and set on the horizon of my consciousness. One of those thoughts I recognized was my sense of I-ness, the ego thought. I sought to fathom its origin and recognize the consciousness from which it emerged. Following Ramana's method of inquiry, my inner exploration ended not in enlightenment, but in frustration. Instead of dwelling in the fullness of reality, my mind raced from one thought to another like a monkey leaping from tree to tree. Ramana's approach is simple, but not easy. It seems to require a mind capable of tremendous concentration and discernment. Apparently, I was not adequately prepared then. Ramana was an adept, a genius of spirituality. Genius is not necessarily the best teacher for mediocre students. A Nobel-winning scientist might lecture at such a high level that only the most sophisticated listeners can understand. In this way, Ramana Maharshi's instruction to inquire, "Who am I?" is perhaps best suited for those who are sufficiently advanced to reach his profound level of insight. I, on the other hand, was no spiritual prodigy. I needed to be taken by the hand and painstakingly led to find what Ramana so easily discovered. Very relatable. And with that, we'll end our reading for tonight.